Hello everyone, welcome back to Shred Guitar in the 80s. So I started playing in the late 70s and it was just an amazing time to start playing because it seemed like every year some new guitar player would come out that would totally change everything, just blow everyone away, and everyone would scramble back to the woodshed trying to figure out all their licks and how they did it. So I thought it'd be kind of fun to maybe cover some parts of the decade of the 80s and pick out some players that blew my mind when I heard them back then. And I'm going to kind of stick with the rock, kind of heavy metal guys in this episode. And in the future, I'll do more of the fusion and stuff like that because the fusion players really had a big impact on me also. But I thought it'd be fun to kind of start out with some of the rock guys since it's shred guitar in the 80s. And it'd kind of talk about the journey that I took hearing these players also. It was just an amazing time to come up. So let's get started. So as I talked about before, the band that really kind of opened the door was kind of the gateway for me in terms of guitar playing, rock guitar playing, and just really wanted to become a musician and kind of emulate what they did, was Kiss. And this is my favorite Kiss album, Kiss Alive. And I used to listen to this album over and over and over. When I first got a guitar for Christmas in 1978, I got Kiss Alive 2. I had this one a couple years earlier. And I remember sitting down and just trying to figure out some of the riffs, and this album really opened a lot of doors for me, and it's still one of my favorite rock albums of all time. I just love it. I mean, the riffs are killer. With songs like Watching You Can't Go Wrong, I loved every song in the album was just killer. Something like that. Every track was just amazing. Ace Frehley. I think my favorite player at that time was Gene Simmons. I was really into Gene Simmons, being a kind of a monster kid growing up reading Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine and all that stuff. I thought Gene was the coolest. So I was kind of more into Kiss as a band and just trying to figure out the riffs. And the next band I got into was AC/DC, and this is my favorite AC/DC album, Power Rage. I just loved every track on this, and I was just totally into AC/DC. I also got into Rainbow around this period. I remember seeing an advertisement in Circus magazine for this album, and I went out and got it and was just blown away by Ritchie Blackmore's playing. I'd heard him in Deep Purple, but I loved the classical elements that he had in Rainbow, and little did I know that that was going to really come to the forefront in my playing in years to come. But this album was another gateway for me in terms of just guitar playing and how far I could take it. So those were the big ones, you know, AC/DC, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, and Rainbow. I would say those were the big ones during that era for me. So I just did my best to try to cop those licks on my dad's 1959 Les Paul Jr. that was shaped like an SG. That was just like the one Carlos Cavazo used during the Quiet Riot days, the early days of Quiet Riot. I love that guitar, and my dad kept it under the bed, and every time he would leave I'd pull it out and jam on it, and then eventually he just let me play it all the time. He wasn't really much of a player. I think he knew like 2 songs, so he's like, just take it, you know. So I ran with it, and I tried to cop those licks the best I could, and you know, little did I know everything was about to change drastically when I heard this next guitar player. I remember being in the basement hanging out with my buddy, and my brother put in this 8-track. And the very first track sounded like a spaceship landing with this bass line, this killer riff. And it caught my eye. I thought, who's that? Well, when the second track kicked in, that's when my world changed. I don't have a bar, but that just blew my mind. And then it just kept building into the higher part, the whatever Eddie does, just mind-blowing. By the time it got to the infamous finger tapping, I remember just sitting here with my jaw open. It was the most amazing thing I'd ever heard. And then that kind of end of the world at the end, that E going down with the echo, it was just amazing. I rushed out, got the cassette, and just tried to devour and learn as much Van Halen as I could. I mean, what can you say about Eddie Van Halen that hasn't been said? You know, you couldn't help be a Van Halen fan. The songs were stellar. I mean, the songs were amazing. The riffs were so new and fresh and rhythmic, and his feel is what got me. And that tone, I mean, no one had a tone like that. It was incredible. You know, he had the phaser set really wide, so it would just be very subtle, and he'd play all those amazing solos, you know. And the thing that kind of blew me away about Eddie wasn't really the finger tapping, it was just like his phrasing, the way he never really ended on the downbeat a lot. It was always on the upbeat, off in the cracks of the beat, kind of. The riffs, you know. Amazing stuff. And to this day, Eddie's probably my biggest influence. If I had to pick one person that totally changed the way I play and what my playing would become, Eddie was the one. Just his phrasing, the way he would do his playing the offbeats, the cracks of the beat on the end on the ands and the uhs a lot, really was huge for me. He had a lot of phrase like or, you know, that kind of thing was just huge. So he was like never in a hurry. Even when he played fast, it was always just so killer and just fluid. That kind of stuff, huge for me. So Eddie changed my world big time. I bought everything I could buy him. I'd even go out and find all the bootlegs that I could. Anything Van Halen. I was a Van Halen kid. And I'm so glad I was, and I'm so glad I am, and I'm so glad I came up when Eddie Van Halen was just starting out, because it was just a mind-blowing, life-changing experience. So I was really into Eddie. He was like kind of my favorite guitar player, and just kind of my whole world was Eddie Van Halen at that time. But it was about to change. There was someone else about to come into that equation. And I remember on a Saturday night about 1 in the morning listening to WMMS in Cleveland, all of a sudden this song came on, and I was an Ozzy fan because of Black Sabbath, and they said, here's the new Ozzy song. And as soon as this riff came in, I was like, wow, that's pretty killer. And by the time it got to the solo, there was some finger tapping and that fluidity in his note choice. He was different than Van Halen, but he was similar enough to Van Halen that it just, I thought there's two of them, you know. So I rushed out and I got this album right here, The Blizzard of Oz, and wore it out. I had it on cassette. I would just listen to it constantly. And the first real picking thing I ever learned was that lick from Mr. Crowley in the song. And I just spent hours listening to Van Halen and Randy Rhoads, you know, and Randy Skelly's was huge. Eddie played more shapes, where he'd kind of run up the neck with symmetrical shapes. That kind of thing, where Randy was actually, his theory was a little different. He wasn't so off the cuff. It was more thematic and very classical influence. And then I rushed out and got Diary of a Madman when it came out, and the production on this was a lot better. His guitar tone in this is just amazing. And my favorite playing during that whole period of Randy's was a live concert I taped off WMMS back in the day, right around the time of the first album. And it would later end up becoming the tribute album. But I would listen to it like crazy. It had a little different solo than the tribute one. I think the tribute one was recorded in Montreal. And I believe the concert I taped off at WMMS was actually recorded in Cleveland. But those albums I just wore out, and that live solo and Suicide Solution was just amazing. Randy was huge on me. So there were two. There was Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads that were rocking my world during that era. And I thought, how can you take guitar any farther than that? I mean, these two guys are amazing. Well, that was about to change when I heard the next guy. And it was probably, what was it, late 1983, fall of 83, I think it was. I was over at my friend's house. We were playing cards on a Friday night. And I turned on the radio, and they announced this band, Alcatraz. Now, I've heard the guitar player, this Yngwie Malmsteen. I didn't know it was Yngwie at the time. I remember reading about him in Hit Parader, and they called him a wonderkind. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. Then I read that he joined this band. He was in Steeler at the time. And Hit Parader did a little blurb on Steeler talking about this amazing guitar player, Yngwie Malmsteen. I didn't know how to pronounce his name. And then I read that he joined this band Alcatraz. Well, I was really curious to hear what he sounded like from when I read the press about him. And when WMS said this is a new band called Alcatraz, I kind of perked up. I was at my friends, we were playing cards, and the song was okay. It was kind of an AOR song. It's probably my least favorite song off the album, No Parole from Rock and Roll. But when the solo came on, I could not believe what I heard. The articulation, the picking, you know, the phrasing, his bending. I just was stunned. You know, not really since hearing Eruption had I been so blown away. So I rushed out the next day. It was a Saturday, and I bought No Parole from Rock and Roll on cassette. And I came home, popped it in, and I was like, how do I learn these licks? I remember I kind of picked out a couple lines, and I'm like, how do I even pick this? It was just incredible with songs like, you know, General Hospital with the cool descending runs he did in that. Hiroshima Mon Amour was just amazing. The Soul and Cree, Nikori, every song would go by in this album the first time hearing it, I was like, oh, what is that? I'd never heard anything so clean and precise and articulate, melodic, and it was just logical, and it was just amazing. And the first real lick I ever learned from Yngwie was the Jet to Jet lick, and I still play that lick, you know, all the time if you watch my channel. It changed everything, and I sat down and figured out that little lick and just went to town trying to figure out ways to play it. And he did it all over the album. He did that lick in Cree Nikori, he did it in Too Young to Die, Too Drunk to Live. It's the Yngwie lick, the infamous Yngwie lick. It was his picking that blew me away the most. You know, I wanted that sound. He had that chirp right with the pick and a space in between. It was so in sync. His synchronization was incredible. And I wanted that sound. I was like, how can I get that? And I was just trying everything I could. And I did some videos on how I stumbled on to be able to pick, if you want to go back and watch some older shred guitar in the 80s. But I devoured this album. I would try to learn every solo. I couldn't play every solo at that time, but I would try my best, and I learned all the cool harmonic minor areas that Yngwie played off this album, and I learned so much. Diminished runs, his arpeggio stuff. The thing was that he didn't do a lot of sweeping on this album. I mean, now he does tons of arpeggios, but back then he would just sneak them in really cool. You had like the Too Young to Die, Too Drunk to Live little arpeggio section, and he did a couple in the solo on Jet to Jet. But, you know, by the time Rising Force came out, it was a lot more developed. Even though I still loved Randy and Eddie and listened to them like crazy and still tried to learn their stuff, Yngwie became an obsession. You know, be able to play, have technique like that, be able to play like that. I wanted to do that. It was everything to me. And I went out and got the amazing live sentence when it came out. I think Yngwie was just at his peak during this period. It was just amazing. You know, the Rising Force album would come out next. You know, I have Black Star as a sound page and guitar player. I'm going to talk more about that in the future. You know, every song in here was mind-blowing. I went out and got bootlegs. You know, then Marching Out and Trilogy and Odyssey and saw him in concert. You know, Yngwie was the man back then. You couldn't walk into a club without someone trying to do arpeggios. You know, I remember getting together with guitar players, and who could play the Yngwie licks the best. It was a little competition there, I think. It was just an amazing time, and Yngwie ruled the world of rock guitar back then, you know. He just ruled the world of rock guitar, if I can say that. But it was amazing stuff, and I'm so glad, like I said, to come up in this era, and just to see all these players come out one after another was just amazing. And Yngwie set the bar, even to this day. I think he kind of laid the groundwork for everything to come. So, you know, Eddie, Randy, Yngwie, those guys were it. So a little bit after I heard Yngwie, being a big Van Halen fan, I heard this band, Rat. And when I heard Rat, I like the song. But then some of the solos on here were so fluid. This legato technique was just amazing. And it was Warren DeMartini. And I remember devouring this album too, and just listening to it over and over and over. And then I went out and got the EP. His playing on this album really kind of set the stage for a lot of things to come. His phrasing was similar to George Lynch, who I was a fan of at the time, and I'll talk more about in future episodes. But the thing is, with Warren, he had these 3-note per string scales really developed. You know, his phrasing and legato was really developed on songs like Wanted Man, you know, In Your Direction, has some cool runs, Back for More. The solo, Back for More, and the outro solo, he does some of the most amazing shredding on that outro solo. I mean, it could be right there at Shrapnel Records. It's just amazing. And it really set the groundwork for things to come, like on Shrapnel Records. And I love that LA sound. I love the intervals. I was a Jakey Lee fan. You know, I was a Michael Schenker fan. I haven't talked about those guys in this episode, but they were right there huge also. And I could hear little elements of that in Warren's playing. Definitely a Van Halen vibe, but his phrasing was very, you know, like I said, similar to Lynch, but man, he was different in so many ways with those 3-note per string scales and how fluid they were. So Warren was definitely a big influence also. And then I heard the next guitar player, and I remember it was a Saturday afternoon, and there was a show called Austin City Limits, and I was just flipping through the channels, and I heard this guitar solo. I saw this blonde-haired skinny guy playing this guitar solo, and I just stopped and watched. I was like, who is that? What is that? And it was Eric Johnson. And I have this old guitar magazine from when he first released his first album. And I didn't have any way to tape it. I had no way to ever hear it again after that. But it made an impression on me. And the way he was playing these pentatonic scales were so different. I didn't even know how to cop it. I remember, was that real? And I tell my friends, did you see that Austin City Limits? There's this guy on there. Who is that? And I remember reading a little bit about him in Guitar World. He's holding the Robin guitar. And they were talking about Texas gunslinger guitar players, you know. Well, that would change when Guitar Player released this issue. There was a sound page at Austin City Limits, close to Dover. And there were those beautiful pentatonic scales that I just longed to hear again and play. And I spent hours trying to play those Eric Johnson arpeggio, or not arpeggios, but pentatonic scales. And I had no way to do it until 1988 or 89, or maybe it was 1990. I think it might have been 1990. The second Austin City Limits came out, and I actually recorded it. And my VCR could slow down, and I could see that he was going down, up, and kind of using downstrokes to cross to the higher string when he was doing those fives. And that set everything up for me. And I got those licks down. Took a little bit to get used to sweep picking. I was more of an alternate picker. Even with Yngwie, I tried to play all these licks alternate, but you know, I worked on it and kind of got the Eric Johnson thing down and figured out a bunch of his solos. And Eric instantly became one of my favorites. And I remember working all the pentatonic positions out. At the time, I kind of played my favorite ones, but I would learn them all and chain them together and just try my best to be Eric Johnson. His vibrato, his tones were amazing, his corgis. He was just like a breath of fresh air. Eric was huge, and he just changed everything too in some respects. You know, it was like all the stuff I wasn't doing, Eric was just so great at, and it really forced me to to play in a little different style and really learn new things, and I can't thank Eric enough for that. Eric's just a beautiful player and seems like a really great guy. So Eric Johnson was definitely in the mix and is one of the guitar players who blew my mind back in the 1980s. Being a fan of guitar, I used to buy these US metal albums, and I bought this one, Volume 4. I think this came out in 84, and I put it on, and it was cool. I loved it. I loved metal back then. I thought the guitar players were great. Nothing really stuck out extraordinary for me. But then on the second side, the second song, this guitar solo came on, and my jaw dropped. I mean, not since hearing Yngwie and not since hearing Eddie Van Halen have been so blown away by guitar player, and it was Shawn Lane. I didn't know anything about Shawn Lane. I wouldn't know anything about him for a few years. I just recorded that on cassette and would listen to it over and over and just try to get some fluidity like that. It was just amazing. And I'm going to talk more about Shawn in future episodes, but I had to mention him because during the time period that we're covering today, 1980 to 1984, Shawn was in the mix, and this guitar solo is still mind-blowing. If you haven't heard it, Stratosphere 2, look it up on YouTube. Your mind will be blown. So anyway, I thought I would come on and talk about some guitar players that blew my mind in the 80s and maybe cover the years 1980 to 1984, and I hope you enjoyed this. I'm really having fun doing this, and until next time, have fun picking.